Are you ready? Ready to bring a revolution to your relationships? Ready for the experiences on your dating adventure to evolve? Ready for more passion, intimacy, connection, and love in your relationship? Ready to heal past relationship wounds? You're in the right place. I'm Alan, the love engineer, and this is the Relationship Revolutions podcast. In this series, you'll get guidance and tips from me, interviews from other relationship experts, insights from couples who already have a great relationship, and other mind-opening conversations.
Yeah, and thanks for the invite. I appreciate it. And I was going through some of your earlier episodes, and it looks like a wide range of topics. I mean, obviously all around relationships, some divorce and unsuccessful relationships, and some good, and the things that come out of it. It's such a nice. Anyhow, I think I'll be doing a lot more listening now that I've discovered you by being invited.
Yeah, that's because the way I look at it, there's so many different things that can affect the relationships, whether it's early days or towards the end of it, and so much of it doesn't get talked about. We're not taught relationships in school. Our parents generally don't teach us. And where do we learn stuff? It's either from other kids in the playground or the classroom, magazines. These days it's social media and the internet, and that can lead people down so many rabbit holes.
Yeah, amen. I mean, the fact that relationships aren't taught in schools is shocking to me, has been for a long time and continues to be. And it's a big problem. And it's the biggest determinant of health and happiness, and somehow completely ignored.
It is. So generally I'll start with the first two questions, which are, how are you and where are you?
Okay, I can do those. Did you just ask those questions, or are you asking them first?
I did, but I can ask them again.
It was me being in the morning.
No worries.
Yeah, I am very well and very glad to be meeting you and talking with you. I am in Connecticut in the United States, just outside of New Haven.
Excellent. And for those who are listening and don't know who you are, Dr. Eran Magen, is it? A PhD from, was it Yale or was it Pennsylvania?
Neither, although they're both part of my world. I got my master's in education and then my PhD in psychology over at Stanford, and then did more work in child psychology and population health at the University of Pennsylvania. And Yale I have a position in now, but it's not where I trained.
So what's your current...
Really, there are three things, and they're all kind of a nice Venn diagram. A few years ago, and I run a company that works with universities on suicide prevention, checking in with students to see how they're doing, and if they're not doing so well, starting to connect them to supports really early on. And at the same time, in parallel, I've been doing parenting skills training around the country, usually through school districts. So working with parents and developing strong, supportive relationships with their kids. And over the past couple of years, I developed a really strong interest in the plight of divorced dads and their kids. The dads are going through a really tough time. They often become disconnected from the kids, and then that means the kids are going through a tough time, and the dads have shockingly high rates of deaths from suicide. And it ends up being in the middle of all the other things that I've been doing. It ends up being kind of an unnatural focus for me, because it's both, I think of it as suicide prevention work, but also as really deep parenting work, starting with the foundational be there principle, right? So helping dads stay connected to their kids. So these are the three things: the suicide prevention work in general, and then parenting work in general, and then supporting divorcing dads and their connection with the kids more specifically.
Interesting. So with the parenting aspect of it, with younger kids, would it be fair to say you get parents reaching out to you saying, how can I change the behavior of my children?
First of all, it's not necessarily young kids. Sometimes it's people that have kids in their 30s, and it's still relevant. And we sometimes start from a place of, how do I change my kids' behaviors? But often I think the starting point is more around, how can parenting be less stressful and more enjoyable? Especially when kids are little, they're such a source of joy to their parents. And then later on, as they grow up and things become more complex, sometimes strife and conflict and friction goes up, and parents miss this time of just taking great delight in their kids. And the goal is to
Yeah.
get back to that point of getting great delight, even with older kids, even when they're 12 or 22 or 30.
Yeah, I can imagine. I've got 14-year-old twins and a 9-year-old stepson and a 6-year-old stepdaughter. So
Oh,
the different stages is like messes with your head on a regular basis.
yeah. Yeah, and the different needs that they have, right? As
Yeah.
they grow, and we have to keep updating how we're thinking about them and how we're interacting with them.
Yeah, especially with stepchildren, because you don't have that. You don't have the same bond that you do with your own children. And it's like, well, where's that line of discipline? Who's it? Is it down to her or is it down to me? And how do I
Yeah,
handle this? Because let's face it, our own kids don't come with a instruction manual, and kids that are already there that come into your life at some point in the journey, you have even less guidance for that.
absolutely, right? You know them less well. They're less inclined to just automatically, let's say, cooperate, right? Whereas
Yeah.
your kids are more likely than stranger kids, and this is somewhere in the middle. Adopted kids that become closer and closer to you, but still can always whip out the "you're not my dad" line, and then what? And that's part of why I think it's so important to rely more on positive relationships and cultivating a desire to cooperate, really, and to collaborate, rather
Yeah.
than trying to establish systems of coercion or intimidation.
Yeah, so let's face it, from an early age, we don't want to be controlled, do we?
No, not at all. I think a lot about power dynamics in parenting. And I
Yeah.
think that vast majority of issues, challenges that parents have with their kids come about because the kids want more power. And it turns out that if you drop the rope, if you stop pulling, right, if you share power, there's no need to fight.
Yeah.
If you find all the ways that you can share power and show respect, kids are going to treat you in kind. And if you don't, if you're super restrictive, then they'll buck and they'll fight for it.
Yeah, the number of times if you try and tell the kids what they want, what you want them to do, they're like, I don't want to do that. But then you say, well, look, do you want to do this, or this? You get, I don't mind, or I don't know.
Yeah.
It's like they want the option of being in control, but they don't want to be in control.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's extremely well put. Yes. Or to have some amount of control or some amount of say. You're probably familiar with the trauma-informed approaches to everything, right? And at the heart of trauma is something terrible that happened without us being able to do anything about it, us having no power in the face of horror. And I'm not saying that growing up is a traumatic event for anybody, not at all, but I think trauma-informed practices really are best practices for kind of everything. And at the heart of trauma-informed practices is giving power in order to not recreate this experience of being powerless. And so any kind of choice that you give people is so much better than no choice. Right? And the more meaningful the choice, the better. And the more people relax around you and feel like they have a voice and they have a say, and bad things aren't just going to randomly happen to them.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we talk about the dad side of things well, there's lots of ways we can go. And one of the things I often share with a lot of people is that I've never met anybody who got married just to get divorced.
Yeah, that's usually not an outcome people have in their mind as they're starting out.
Right. If you are in that place, you think, why would you get married anyway? And also find that both across there in the States and here, I think there's a very high percentage of divorces that are filed by the women.
I will take your word for it. To be honest, I'm not up to date on the statistics. I don't know who initiates. And sometimes I know it flip-flops along the way once it gets going.
Yeah, because there's all sorts of stuff on social media. I don't know where to dig into to find out if it's accurate or not over there. I have looked into the UK, and it does seem that around 70% of divorces are filed by women. And the number of women I speak to who are going either divorced or going through it or contemplating it, they spend years trying to get through to the husband that they want things to change or things need to change. And it's like it falls on deaf ears. Until that day, they get their divorce petition come through the post or she says, I want a divorce. And he's like, oh, I'll do anything to make it work. He was clueless as to what's going on. So the question is, what can us as men and as dads do to prevent that happening along the way?
Yeah. What a great question. So often when I talk about this, the question is, what do we do after to recover? But it's very rare that people think about prevention,
Yeah.
right? So what a great question. To go all the way to the beginning, part of it is about the choice of mate. It's very important to think very carefully about, is this going to be a sustainable relationship? And not to jump into it. And so when things that are concerning come up, they typically come up early in the relationship. And very often people ignore them. They push them
Yeah.
down, and like the proverbial balloon, they'll pop back up after a little while. And so to not push them down, but rather address them, if there are things that really don't work between two people right from the start, to pay careful attention to it, either fix them or think about, can this be sustained?
Yeah, because
So, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think when we walk down the aisle, we've got, although a lot of it may be unconscious, an image or a blueprint of what a good marriage is, what a husband is, what a wife is. And there's this almost kind of assumption that both partners have the same picture in their minds, and that's not always the case.
Yeah, right. And so some conversations before actually tying the knot about what this means to both of us, what are red lines for each of us, what's the vision that we have. Hopefully this happens before even talking about getting married, right? Is what's the vision that we have for our lives and so on. In the end though, right, a lot of planning can happen, and then all kinds of unexpected things can follow.
Oh, yes.
So at the beginning, paying a lot of attention to match and paying a lot of attention to courting expectations, but then keeping those things alive. I think it's a good idea to sit down, formally schedule a time that is not just a regular date, but schedule a time once a quarter, 2 times a year, something of sitting down and really saying, like, what's working here, what's bothering you, and so on. And being able to give good feedback. I think a lot of people make the mistake of not being willing to go to couples counseling.
Yeah.
When one of the people suggests it, it's always a good idea to go to couples counseling. It's important to pick a counselor that works for both people, and that's maybe a separate conversation of how to do it. But the very short version is that most counselors will offer a 5 to 10 minute free kind of a vibe check consult. And if you start working with somebody and they don't work for you, that's okay. You can go work with somebody else. But if your partner is asking you for couples counseling, the least helpful thing to do is to say, no, we don't need it. And so take it seriously and go do it. And I think the two most important emotions to pay attention to in a relationship, in my opinion, are joy and contempt. And if you're starting to feel contemptuous of your spouse, or if you get the sense that your spouse is contemptuous of you, that's a big warning sign. And that means that your relationship needs to go front and center. If you want to preserve it, like, it's time to make that your absolute number one priority. Or if there's, somebody terminally ill in your life, maybe your number two priority. But think about it really hard. Like, that's a very, very big risk sign. And on the flip side, the joy, right? Do you look forward to time with, and maybe a lot more time with, your spouse? And if it's starting to dwindle, that means this requires attention. This is really important. So really kind of big picture, abstract notions. I don't know how much more concrete you want it to get, but I think that's where it starts.
Yeah, I think with things like this, there's no right or wrong answers. So all is good. And I think in some ways...
And in the bottom line, also, I would add that you also can't control the relationship or your spouse. Sometimes the other person's preferences or needs or wishes change. And this can happen. Separations can happen and divorces can happen. They don't mean that somebody did something wrong, but it means that the relationship is no longer viable. And at some point, it's also important to accept that with some grace and be able to start working toward resolving the separation.
Yeah, very much so. And I think when it comes to things like couples counseling or coaching, the best time to start doing those things is when the relationship's in a good position, so you can keep it there. Because when you don't even think about doing that until the relationship's already in a mess, it just makes the job so much harder. It's almost like trying to service your car when it's on the side of the road, broke down at 3 o'clock in the morning. If you'd have got
Yeah.
a service the week before or 2 weeks before, that breakdown could easily have been prevented.
Yeah. I agree. I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. I think people often struggle with finding time or money or motivation to go do counseling when everything's okay, quote unquote. It may be a nice thing to do to agree to go to counseling without having it mean that there's a problem, but in order to continue improving the relationship, just like, we may keep exercising even though we're not sick or hurting, and we may keep studying even though we're not losing cognitive ability, right? We keep improving. And to frame it as this is how we're continuing to improve the relationship, we're going to sit down with a professional and talk about how do we make communication even better, and how do we make sure we're coordinated with parenting even better than we are now, things like that. Yeah, I think that's a great idea.
So I think once we go through the divorce process, and in some ways almost even the dating thing, men don't understand what it's like for women, and women don't understand what it's like for men. So for the women that are listening, what experiences are the guys that you work with going through?
I'll start from the other side, with your permission. I'll just mention very briefly for the guys, that one thing that many men don't understand is how literally afraid women are of men in these situations. There are a lot of cases of violence against women. It doesn't mean that any particular man is going to be or was or is violent toward any particular woman, but most women walk around with very understandable, very justifiable fear of being physically hurt by a man in the process of separation, right? And so men may do things that to them seem benignly angry, and women may think he's going to kill me, literally actually kill me. And I think that's an important awareness to carry in mind, and has implications in terms of how we want to set up communication, how we want to make sure that everybody's feeling safe, because otherwise things can escalate really quickly when women try to implement systems for ensuring their own safety, which can be very upsetting for men when they don't understand the kind of fear that many women live with. Okay, so having said this, the things that men experience almost the opposite in a sense, right? So the first, like you said, is shock often of being told that the relationship is effectively over, even though from the women's side, it may seem like we've been talking about this for a year now or more, or it's been clear all the signs are there, and for the man that may be a total surprise. And so just expecting a surprise response, I think, is another thing that happens sometimes with good reasons. Sometimes as volunteers, men will often take a request for a divorce or an announcement the relationship is over as a damning judgment of their character. And that's not always the case. It sometimes is, but it's not always the case. And I think it's important to communicate clearly what it is that you're trying to communicate, right? And so if I were separating from someone and I'm saying, I don't want to be in a relationship with you, you're intolerable, or this is intolerable, and I feel completely invalidated and invisible and so on, that's one feel. And another is to say, I want to end the relationship, we've had amazing times, but this doesn't work for me anymore. I think that you're a good person, but I don't think that we work as a couple. Very different feel. And it's easy for men to interpret a separation or a breakup or a divorce as, like I said, a very strong, very negative judgment on their character. So that's another thing to know. Two more things that I think are good to know. One is men, it might shock every listener to hear, often don't really share what they're feeling. And often also don't have people to talk with about what they're feeling. And so they're stuck with really strong emotions echoing inside of them and can get very confused about what they want, what they're hoping for, what they think will actually happen, what they think is the right way to address the situation. But just realizing that there's not a big support network for men is important. Because I think the reality for many women is different. Women are leagues better at forming close, open, intimate, vulnerable relationships with friends, with family members, getting support, asking for support and getting support and processing together with other people. And it's so incredibly beneficial. And sometimes it's hard to imagine people who don't have the skills or don't have the resources. And many men don't have the skills and don't have the resources. So just keeping that in mind, I think, is useful. Lastly, a stereotypical male reaction to feeling upset is withdrawing and becoming secluded. And this can even happen in the context of family, right? So fathers that have kids and are going through a very, very difficult period and they're not sure what to do. And maybe they're getting an explicit message, or maybe they're interpreting the message to be, you're not a good person, you're not a safe person, I don't want to be with you, you shouldn't be part of this family. And the whole thing can kind of escalate, again, either in their heads or in the actual conversation. And men find themselves withdrawing even from their kids, or believing that the kids don't want them, or that the mother doesn't want them around the kids, and so on. Most fathers desperately want to be good fathers to their kids. And this is something that I really would encourage everybody to keep in mind. Possibly the mothers going through the divorce with the fathers, friends who are supporting. Probably the single strongest motivation that you can provide to a divorcing father is help your kids, and to remind them that being in their lives, in their kids' lives, is extremely important. That disappearing is harmful to the kids, I think is so important for everybody to keep in mind. So those are the things I would say.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, certainly the thing about men not having a space to talk to, we don't always need it, but then when we do, we rarely do. And I think part of that is the conditioning we get growing up as young boys. Boys don't cry, don't feel emotions, just suppress it, put it down, whatever it is, crack on, get on with the job, you've got stuff to do. And it just gets pushed to one side, and then eventually it comes up like a volcano, normally at the wrong moment in time. Men don't have that space. As years ago, there would be working men's clubs, and now things like that have either been closed because it's sexist, or they've got to allow women in. So you don't have that space. And a lot of married men, once they are married, they start to lose touch with their friends. They don't go out so much because they're married, and then the kids come along, and it's even more reason they need that space, but they just don't have it. And when it comes to the withdrawal thing, what comes up for me is the way John Gray talks about it, about men going into a cave, as if back in the caveman days, if they're going through a challenging time, they would retreat back to the cave and reflect on it, and they didn't leave the cave until they got the solution to whatever the problem is. And I think we do the same thing today. It's just more of a internal emotional cave, even if we're in a room full of 1,000 people. If we need to go to the cave, we go. But women don't do that, so they try and follow the man into the cave, which doesn't go down very well.
Yeah, there are times when going into the cave works well, and there are times when it doesn't. And sometimes it's hard to know the difference. And I guess the challenge is that it's the instinctive reaction. So, we stub our toe, we go into the cave, we rub our toe, we feel better, we come out. We lose a leg, our leg falls off, we drag ourselves into the cave, we sit there, we bleed out, we die. And it's tricky because the instinct is to go into the cave for many men, right? And that's why it is so helpful for others also to get involved, to check in, to see how people are doing, and to really encourage people to connect to supports, whether informal supports like friends and family, or to formal support mechanisms.
Yeah. And I think as men, when we tend to talk is when we're doing other stuff as well, whether it's going out for a hike or going hunting, sitting on the side of a river with a fishing rod. Actually, I can't think of anything more tedious, but some people enjoy it. But we talk when we're doing. I think that again goes back to the days of hunter-gatherers and cavemen, and because whilst we're out hunting for dinner, we'll be talking with our mates.
Yeah, I agree. And also, all of these activities share another thing in common, which is there's less intense looking at each other.
Yeah.
Right. A lot of good conversations happen sitting next to each other in the car, just because there's not that really intense, examination of each other's faces all the time, which we're sometimes uncomfortable with. So going on a walk and just talking side by side is super helpful.
Yeah, because face to face, yes, it can be intimate, but it can also come across very confrontational.
Yeah, there's something a little too exposed for many people in it.
Mm. I think what you were saying about when she files for divorce and that emotional side for men, and it feels like a personal thing, like we're not good enough or whatever it is. I think there's so much, whether it's conditioning or just an expectation that the man is the leader of the family, or if you like, the captain of the ship, and the captain goes down with the ship. If that ship's hit an iceberg or whatever, it's the captain's fault. If it sailed into the middle of a war zone, it's the captain's fault. So we tend to take a lot of responsibility for the relationship breaking down, whatever the reason for it be.
That's very insightful. I haven't thought about it like that before, but I think if there is a man who sees his role as being the captain of the ship, then yeah, of course any problem eventually can be traced back to the captain.
Yeah. When me and my kids' mother separated, I just came home to an empty house. It's like, what the heck is... Initially, I couldn't comprehend what was going on. It's like, where's that gone? Where's that gone? Where's she gone? Where's the kids? And it's like, this doesn't make any sense. So I popped round to see the neighbours, and they said, oh, she put the kids in the car about 2:00 in the afternoon. They were screaming their heads off, and when she loaded all the other stuff up in the car, we didn't know what was going on. We didn't want to interfere, so we didn't call you. Thanks.
Oh, so that absolutely sounds traumatic. To come back and just have everybody be gone.
Yeah, it's shall we say it's a gift, but in some very nasty wrapping paper.
Yeah, deeply concealed gift.
Yes, and she was also had a passport for another country because she was born in elsewhere, and it's like, well, are they even in the country? No notes, nothing.
Yeah, just a moment of total free fall, right? When you come back home and realize everything's gone. Yeah, the ground disappeared. Sounds terrifying.
Yeah. Luckily, the police were really supportive when I phoned up and reported them missing. They phoned back after half an hour and said, they are safe, they are in the UK, get some legal advice, goodbye. Great.
It's a start, right? Yeah, police are very, very disinterested in interfering past the point of danger, right? If everybody's safe, they will probably not interfere because they don't want to be stuck in the middle too. But at least you learned that they're safe, and in the UK, as you said.
Yeah. It's definitely a challenging time. But now, what is it, 13 and a half years later, nearly 14 years later, got a great relationship with the kids. Their mother, well, that's still very tenuous, far from amicable. But everyone seems to be mostly in a good place.
Yeah, and I think that's such an important message to propagate too, right? I mean, aside from your individual story and its implications to you, which obviously are real, and obviously, that moment from 14 years ago is still very much alive in your head. I mean, it sounds like such a shocking moment. I mean, I imagine it's going to be hard to forget ever, but it's so important to send out this message that it gets better. And in fact, like you said, it's usually a gift in some very nasty wrapping. And people feel better in a matter of, either many months or some handful of years. But at the end of this, often people say, I am so glad this happened. I just wish the process weren't so painful. Yeah. And there are things to do to make the process less painful, but you can't make it totally pain-free usually. But this message is so important that it gets better, because in those first months, when you're deep into it, it just seems like everything is bad and nothing will ever get better. And then that's when people either completely withdraw, disappear from their kids' lives, contemplate suicide. Like that, this is when it happens. So people have to hear that it gets, not only do people recover, but typically say like, oh, this is a good thing that happened.
Yeah. And I think, looking back on my own journey, shall we say, that a lot of it's is down to the decisions that I made. Because I think it's about a year after the separation, I just kind of hit rock bottom, and I couldn't afford to live in the house that I owned, what was the family home that I still owned. I couldn't sell it. I couldn't afford to rent it out. And it's like, well, what do I do? And I was that close, just 2 millimeters away from selling what I could, buying a flight to New Zealand, just running away and starting again. But I've got 2 kids, and they need a dad. So it's like, I don't know how to be that dad. I know what I want to be. I don't know how to get there. It's like, okay, that becoming that man is an absolute must. So reach out for help at that point and learn.
It's amazing. Yeah,
and take responsibility.
You had your anchor, you had your North Star, and then you fashioned yourself into the man you needed to be. Your kids needed you to be.
Yeah. So it's like, okay, what aspects of my dad do I like? Okay, that bit. And what other guys do I respect? Okay. There's a guy from Metallica, the guys from Iron Maiden, maybe Hugh Jackman, maybe some movie character or something, and blend it all together and create a new version of me from that.
What was the help that you reached out to?
Well, I hired a life coach, which I couldn't afford at the time, but then I couldn't afford not to. And also went down to Tony Robbins' Unleash the Power Within in London for 3 days. Couldn't afford to do that either, especially not with 3 or 4 days stay in a hotel down there.
Yeah.
Right. And of course, Tony being Tony, you can't buy 1 ticket. You buy 2 for the price of 1. But it just happens to be nearly £1,000. So it's like, what do I do with this other one? So I managed to find a buyer for that, which covered the hotel, and then just didn't eat for 3 days.
Yeah, but you made some strong priorities. Said I couldn't afford it, but more than that, I could not afford not to.
Yeah, and I also found there's a lot of information and guidance in books as well. Something I refused to do up until that point because it looked like schoolwork.
What were your favorites? Or the most helpful ones, you think?
One of them would be Dr. Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People.
Yeah, amen.
And also liked Robert Kiyosaki's Rich Dad Poor Dad and Cash Flow Quadrant.
Yeah.
Things like that. Richard Branson's Losing My Virginity. All sorts. Then what have I got behind me? I've got Beyond Mars and Venus. That was a recent one. Catch Your Match by Steve Elliott. And a couple of other more recent ones. Dave Grohl's autobiography, Bruce Dickinson's autobiography. There's so much information and wisdom that's around. It might be on a podcast. It might be in a book. It might be on a YouTube video. It's all out there for free. You've just got to be willing to look for it. And sometimes all that stuff is so overwhelming, you just need a bit of guidance and help as to which direction to go.
Yeah, where to start.
Yeah, hence you do what you do, and I do what I do.
Yeah, I love that you turn to books, and like you said, I mean, it can feel like schoolwork, but there's so much wisdom there, right? I mean, people write these books because they care, not because they're going to become rich off of it, because they have something to share. It's so wonderful, right? I mean, technically talking, we could call it bibliotherapy, but it's self-help, like in the not sort of derogatory sense, but it's really books that let you help yourself, and it's a way to connect with people. If you can't hire Stephen Covey. I mean, now certainly you can't. It'd have to be a medium, but you couldn't hire Stephen Covey to coach you. But you can read his book, and that's a good connection.
Yeah,
I think that's so wonderful. I know that over here, the public libraries, everything is so digitized now that once you get a public library, you can get an app that lets you borrow books digitally. You can listen to them as audio. You can read them on your device, or you can go in and borrow the books. Is it kind of a similar system for you in terms of ease of access to these books?
Yeah. One little nugget I heard at a talk, it was back in 2006. I was still married at the time. The speaker had gone out and interviewed all sorts of what he deemed to be successful people. And one of the people he interviewed was an Olympic athlete called Chris Akabusi. And at the start of that conversation, he goes something like, "Hey, Chris, how's it feel to have everybody looking up at you?" And Chris Akabusi turns around and says, "Well, that's where everybody goes wrong. They look up to successful people instead of looking into them to find out what drives them, what makes them tick, and more importantly, what they did to get to where they are, so that you can do it too." And that's something that really stuck with me from then on. It's like, looked at some of the people I was looking up to at that time, looked into them instead, and you find, actually, you're a bit of a knob, aren't you? I'm not going to follow you anymore. I'm not going to listen to your stuff either.
Yeah, it's a great tip. It's a great tip.
So I hear lots of stories regarding the family court system over in the States as it being very much in favour of mothers and very dead against fathers. Is that the case, or is it just one or two sour grapes from dads who didn't get what they wanted? Or
Has been, and it's shifting toward a more balanced view. So right now, 1 out of 6 custody cases end up giving custody to the mother. So in that regard, it's not very balanced. This is historical. This is over a couple of decades. Now, anecdotally, more and more I hear about courts awarding shared custody. I think it's still far from a perfect system. It's a very, very slow system. The courts are in no hurry as long as nobody's in danger, sort of like the police. In no hurry. And it can take months and years. And one of the implications is that the status quo gets preserved for a very long time until the court intervenes. And again, the courts are just not in a rush to intervene unless somebody's at risk. And so that means that the very first parenting schedule, formal or informal, that gets decided will probably last for a very long time. And so it's important to immediately work hard to have the kind of schedule that you want as a parent with your kids, and not accept very little time with your kids with the hope that this will change later or that everybody will calm down and so on. Like if that's a priority for you, that's something to immediately work on. Having said this, I think the system is becoming a lot more fair and balanced with respect to seeing the roles of fathers and mothers, but it's in progress. Right. And so some judges are not there yet. Some lawyers are not there yet. Some lawyers will discourage clients from asking for too much, quote unquote, too much being shared custody, saying that this may not work. And you know what? The lawyers may be right. If you get to the wrong judge and the judge thinks that that's not how it should be. Having said this, to me, all this comes down to, yes, asking for exactly what you want, and not assuming in advance that it's not going to work, that you're not going to get it, that just because you're a man, you won't be listened to, and so on. I think the court system, the family court system, is ultimately more or less fair. It just takes a really long time, and you have to be really meticulous.
Yeah, I think it helps massively if both parents can communicate themselves, or at least agree on some things. Because where there's just nothing but animosity and conflict, and then they both go out and hire lawyers at ridiculous prices per hour, both are acting in the best interest of their client or their bank balance, one or the other, and then they go to court, both trying to, not necessarily looking for the best solution for the kids.
Yeah. I think fighting is losing, and I think fighting in court is losing big time. And I think that lawyers that have before them the option of going to court will more or less always end up in court, because that's just how the financial incentives are lined up, right? When a lawyer goes to court, they're paid hourly, at least here. And that means that if they're going to court with you and you just hang out in the waiting area for 2 hours, and then you hang out in the courtroom for 2 hours, and then you actually have the hearing for 4 hours, you're paying them to breathe, and you're paying a lot of money for the lawyers to breathe. For them, it makes sense to polarize and escalate. So you end up in court because, again, that's how the financial incentives are lined up for them. I think ideally you never go to court. Ideally, you work with a mediator and figure it out. And if you can't work with a mediator, you can work with a non-adversarial lawyer. There's a whole movement or philosophy that's springing up here. And these are lawyers that you work with. And at the start of your work together, you sign an agreement saying they cannot represent you in court, meaning that if you decide to go to court, all the time you spent with them is a wash. You have to start over with a new lawyer. And that's a strong financial incentive for the parents to not go to court. And I think that's a fantastic idea, as much as possible to stay out of court. Good mediators can be good non-adversarial divorce professionals, lawyers, accountants, and so on, can be fantastic. Going to court, I've never once encountered a case where somebody went to court and it was just very straightforward and not obscenely expensive and stress-free. That's never the story of going to court. So I would advise avoiding it at all costs, but sometimes you have to, of course. And in those cases, you do, but not rush there. And even I would suggest, if both parties can agree, if both parents can agree not to hire lawyers that can represent them in court, but only to work with non-adversarial lawyers, that changes the whole tenor of the conflict.
Yeah. In the UK, you're, for the most part, not allowed to, a case is not allowed to go to court unless it's been through mediation and failed.
Yeah. It's often the case here too, where if you go to court without mediation, they'll refer you to court mediation, which is separate. But getting to court often happens after people hire their own lawyers to look at their case and advise them. And the lawyers often are warmongers. And so that very first step of like immediately hiring a lawyer when things are starting, and the kind of lawyer who could represent you if it's adversarial, that's a step that I think is, it's this tiny decision that you make that seems very reasonable and can end up costing you years of life, unbelievable amounts of stress, and huge amounts of money. Whereas if both parents can agree to work together with a non-adversarial lawyer, even two separate non-adversarial lawyers that will advise them, but cannot represent them in court and cannot refer them to anyone to represent them in court, the trajectory changes from the start.
Yeah.
And people can look up, you can type the name in the US, you can type the name of your state and non-adversarial divorce services or non-adversarial divorce attorneys, and you can find these folks.
Is it a different legal system from one state to another?
It is in some ways, and in others not. So I'm not a legal expert. I should say at the outset, because I hear everybody saying this at the outset, nor will I be dispensing any tax advice. But it is a little bit different. So in some states, different states have, for example, different laws regarding how much of assets are shared and how much are not. Which assets are shared and which are not. Things that you had before you got married, only after you got married. Some of the things you had after getting married, and so on. So the rights to assets and asset distribution differs by state, and the circumstances that change those rights differ by states. In some states, if there was infidelity, then the parent, the spouse that was involved in an affair may have less rights than the other one. In other states, it doesn't matter. And so these things can change from one state to another. Same with child support and how that's determined. These are all determined at the state level.
So if your ex-partner moves to a different state, then I would think that'd be an absolute nightmare.
It would, yes. I think establishing a jurisdiction is important, and for different people, maybe different states would be more beneficial depending on their case. Generally speaking, one state will own a case. You can't have a case going on in two different states at once, is my understanding. Again, check with a lawyer, but that's my understanding. It is possible to move a case from one state to another, either with the consent or without the consent of the other parent, if the courts see a good reason to do it. Parents can take their kids and go, as you are painfully aware from your own experience. There are some legal remedies, right? You might immediately go to a lawyer and say, my ex-partner took the kids and is leaving for this other place, and they'll file an emergency thing, and the court may issue an emergency order that says they have to come back. These things do matter because, like I said before, by and large, courts are really reluctant to change the status quo without a huge amount of deliberation. And so if your partner takes the kids and goes to some other state, and you only file a thing, after thinking about it carefully for 2 months and then build your case, whatever, they're not coming back to the original. They're established there. The court is very unlikely to say that they need to come back for your convenience, as it were, because they'll say, no, the kids are established, they have a life, and they have a routine, right? So for things like that, it requires instant action.
Yeah.
Hopefully, I don't know the statistics. I hope that it's pretty rare. I hope that parents are willing and able to talk to each other about these things. If you're concerned that something like that is on the move, that unfortunately is a time to go get a lawyer, make sure that this action is booked.
Yeah, we don't have that kind of thing so much here in the UK, unless the other parent, shall we say, is taking them out of the country. And it's officially, they're not allowed to do that without written consent, but let's face it, when you book a flight, they don't ask.
In practice, they can,
Yeah, then you end up having to go to court to say, can we get them to come back? Which some countries are easier than others, which is probably a bit easier when we were back in the EU, but hey-ho, things change.
Yeah, and this is part of why I think it's so important to keep things as low conflict as possible. It's very easy to get so agitated for everybody, for the men, for the women in this story. Once somebody escalates, the other person will escalate, and then it just becomes this very vicious cycle, and things get out of hand very quickly. And so, as quickly as possible, to establish safety, to establish respectful communication, to establish intention to communicate and coordinate and not do things by surprise, and just help keep everybody a little calmer.
Yeah.
So important. Otherwise, you have this standoff situation where everybody's pointing guns at everybody, and then somebody twitches, and then suddenly all the guns go off.
Yeah, and at the same time, you don't want to be a doormat and let the other one walk all over you. So there's a very fine line somewhere between the two.
Yeah. I think good, assertive communication, saying, this is a very confusing time for us, for the kids. The most important thing is to make sure that the kids are not experiencing conflict and tension. I want to make sure that we're in communication, and I'm open to communicating in whatever way is comfortable for you. But I want to make sure that we're in agreement that we're not changing anything in our kids' lives and routines without discussing it with one another. For example, like that's an opening move.
Yeah. Certainly would be the ideal thing for most couples.
To at least start with this kind of communication. Yeah. And get into mediation as quickly as possible.
Yes, and that thing I find with a mediator is they have legally got to be impartial, but at the same time, sometimes one party or the other will think that mediator's on their side.
Yeah. I was thinking just now how going to a mediator at the very start of a separation or a divorce, even if things are going well, is very much like a parallel to going to a couples counseling therapist, even if things are going well, right?
Yeah.
You absolutely want to prevent an escalation in the separation dynamics. It is disastrous for everybody involved when it escalates. Again, sometimes you have to. Sometimes your your ex-husband or your ex-wife is doing things that are just unacceptable, and you have to resist. But ideally, you establish effective communication early on. Just go straight into mediation, because also the mediators have done it 1,000 times before. They've seen 1,000 other people. You're probably only getting divorced for the first, maybe second time. Most people don't do it beyond that. And a good mediator, in a way, I mean, to say it cynically, a good mediator will have both people feeling like the mediator is not on their side. And good mediators are very skillful at making clear that they're sometimes supporting one position, sometimes supporting another position. But if you are going to a mediator and you do feel like it's too one-sided and unfair, first of all, talk about it with the mediator. And you can talk about it individually with the mediator.
Yeah.
Send an email or call and say, can we set up a small conversation? I'm not comfortable with the way this is going. They'll talk to you, partly because they're usually good people that want to do right by everybody, and also because they want your business. And if you feel like the mediator is really very biased, ask to switch to a different mediator. Say that this feels really biased, and ask to switch, and establish criteria for how to pick that person. But mostly just be in mediation. Like, it's even a bad mediator is better than no mediator. Just having a place to talk and to set some rules of engagement.
Yeah. So is there anything else that you can think of right now that the listeners might want or need to hear from you, either about what you do, where you've been, your life?
A couple of things. We already touched on how things get better. And I think it's such an important thing to keep in mind. If you're going through that, or if you know somebody who's going through that, to keep in mind that things can get very horribly bad, and things usually end up being much better than they were before. So that's a critical message to keep in mind. Another is the temptation to disappear can be very strong. Disappear meaning withdrawing from the family and maybe moving, maybe just disconnecting completely, or maybe actually thinking about killing yourself. The temptation can be enormous at times. Sometimes you'll tell yourself you're doing other people a favor. Sometimes you'll tell yourself you're doing yourself a favor, and so on. In those moments, whether you are the person thinking about this or whether you're a person supporting a person thinking about this, always bring up the kids to yourself, to your friend, right? It's always the right thing to stay in your kids' lives and to harness that motivation exactly like you did, right? To become a better person, to become the man, the father that they need in their lives, or to be the father that they need, because very likely you're already a good dad. And your kids will benefit so much more from having you in their lives than, right, whatever version of you are, having you in their lives will be so much better for the kids. And you will keep becoming a better and better father the more contact you have. So that's a crucial message. And I'll say also, if you're a father going through divorce, or if you're a friend or family of father going through divorce, connection is critical. So if you're a person going through divorce, reach out to people for support. Read books, yes, by all means, absolutely. But also talk to people. And you don't have to talk to people like deep, agonizing, therapeutic conversations all the time. Hang out with people. Don't become totally disconnected. And occasionally, like, have a real conversation. But reach out to friends. Don't be ashamed about getting divorced. Don't be embarrassed about it. This happens. People will not judge you just because you're going through a divorce. People want to help. If you have anybody who's any kind of a friend, talk to them. Say, I'm going through a divorce right now. I don't really know how to talk about this, but, it would be nice to have some company sometime. And you will be amazed at how people will respond, how warmly and supportively people will respond. Or say this to family. If you have nobody to talk to, look around for support groups. Reach out to a therapist or a coach. You can call in the UK, I believe it's 111 for the NHS, 24 hours a day. People are there, will talk to you. Yeah, that's right. Different number for the Samaritans, I think. I'm looking at it now. 116 123. People are there 24/7. People will talk with you, but reach out and connect. And if you know somebody going through divorce or separation, be the person that checks in with them once a week. Makes a huge difference. Put it on your schedule, right? Wednesdays, 7, call Alan, right? And just check in. And again, it doesn't have to be deep, agonizing conversations. Just be a person. Just say, how's it going? I know this is a rough time. How are you feeling? Yeah. How are your kids doing? Oh, that really sucks. I'm sorry to hear that. Do you want to talk more about this? No? Okay. Do you want to do something maybe later this week? I do think it's a good idea to connect. Let's do something. Do you want to go, play bowling with me? Whatever. So be the person that checks in, and check in if you can for a while, weekly, for months, because everybody checks in the first few weeks and then everybody forgets. Be the person that doesn't forget. So those are my suggestions. As far as, last and most importantly, I almost forgot, find ways to enjoy your life. Your kids will be better. Your kids will do better if they have a happy father. Being miserable all the time is not the mark of somebody who's committed to the family that was snatched away from him, right? It's tempting to be the stoic hero and say, well, I have no life now that this happened, and I'll just sit here and wait for the times that I can be a dad, and beside that, I won't really live. No, do the opposite. Live. Enjoy yourself. Figure out activities you've been wanting to do all this time and couldn't. Go on a trip, responsibly, right? But do all the things, or do the things that make you happy. Schedule them. It's an opportunity to meet people as well. Just have friends and have community. Like, enjoy your life. Your life will not improve spontaneously. It's up to you, right? And you can improve your life.
Yeah.
So that I think is a message that I really want to make sure I get out there. And as far as my own work goes, you can see people can connect with me and material that I put out at divorcingdads.org. There's a podcast that I started recently called Divorcing Dads, where I talk with divorcing dads as they go through their process, exactly to be able to show this kind of arc that people go through. Right? So people have a sense of what this may look like in the weeks and months to come, and how there is a light at the end of the tunnel. And just connect and enjoy your life. The parallel of 111 or Good Samaritans in the UK for the US is 988. Again, it's a free service. Counselors are there 24/7. You can call if you're unhappy, if you think you might be in crisis, if you're worried about somebody else. You can call these numbers. People are there to talk you through it.
Excellent. So where can people find you if they want to reach out to you?
Yeah, the easiest is at divorcingdads.org, or you can email me at Eran, Eran, at divorcingdads.org. That's the easiest. And then the general parenting work that I do is at parentingforhumans.com. But I think today the focus was on the divorcing dads.
Excellent. So, final question. And you mentioned you've listened to some of my stuff before, so you might know what to expect here. You might not, I don't know. So, the question is, as this podcast is called Relationship Revolutions, from your perspective, if there was one thing that will bring a revolution or evolution to the world of dating and relationships, what would it be?
Authentic, real-time communication for all of us to be able to own and express our emotions in an authentic way. I think it's a terrifying prospect in some ways because it'll immediately make clear mismatches, but make it possible to work on whatever friction exists. So I think by far and away, the most important thing is to be able to communicate authentically as close to real time as possible. And it's a tough skill to develop, but it's worth working on.
Absolutely. And sometimes I think the hardest part with things like that is really getting to know who this person is within the body so that you can communicate that authentically.
Yeah, amen. Learning to listen to ourselves so we can express ourselves and then listen to the other person as they express themselves.
Love it. So it's been an honour and a pleasure having you on and having a conversation with you. And no doubt we will see you again on the online space sometime in the near future. And I'll go and even check out your podcast for myself.
Wonderful. Yeah, thanks very much. This was a wonderful, wonderful conversation. A pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you for listening. And if you haven't already, please leave me a review on your preferred podcast platform. Click the like button and also subscribe so that you get the new episode notifications. I'm curious, what did you take away from this episode? Please share your takeaways with me. Send me an email to relationship-revolutions@theloveengineer.rocks.